emerged. So what was it in the real economy that was resulting in the subprime crisis? Okay. Now, because I've been anticipating some of this, so I've been collecting the headlines of the New York Times going back to about April 2007. So in this paper that I've written, I've given a timeline of how the crisis evolved and which segments of the economy were in a crisis. And when you read that, you realize that almost all aspects of the financial sector were in a crisis. So whether it's the insurance companies, whether it's the normal banks, whether it's the investment banks, whether it's the various instruments that were the derivatives, etc., almost all aspects, credit rating agencies, and whether it's the auditors, everybody was involved in this financial sector. So in the headlines, you can see from the New York Times, if you build the story, that how slowly and slowly every aspect of the financial sector, every aspect of the financial instruments, they are getting sucked into this crisis. And all of them are involved in this crisis. So the important thing is that comes out of this is that financial markets are not self-stabilizing. You see, you must notice over the last 20 years, financial markets have got more and more deregulated. And before Ben Bernanke came, it was Alan Greenspan who was the Federal Reserve Chief. And Alan Greenspan was considered God by the financial sector. Whatever Alan Greenspan said was whatever the financial markets did. And he was saying markets are self-stabilizing, therefore deregulate the markets. So the deregulation of the financial markets that took place in the USA took place under the guidance of the Federal Reserve Bank. Okay. And now, about a month back, when Alan Greenspan appeared before the Congress to give his testimony, he said, I was wrong. For 16 years, I believed this. Now I know I was wrong. And he said, markets are not self-stabilizing. They require regulation to stabilize. Okay? So Alan Greenspan, the god of financial world for such a long time, has admitted that, and that is one of the key problems. And the question is, what kind of things, therefore, would work? And it's in this context that government intervention that has been taking place has led to the collapse slowing down. If you notice in September, October, before these huge packages were announced, okay, the collapse was very steep. Post mid-October, the collapse has slowed down somewhat. But nonetheless, the decline in the economic and the financial markets is continuing. Okay. So in that sense, the important point I'll make in this presentation is that it's not just the financial sector that's collapsing. It's also the economic aspects of the thing, the real economy, that also was a part of the collapse. And that was part of the reason for why the financial markets also started collapsing. And the analysts, the politicians, and the media were all in a denial mode until September 2008. Until then, everybody's denying. Everybody's saying, no, things are under control, things will be under control, we'll manage, things are not so bad. So there's a state of denial. It's only after September that this state of denial has declined. Okay. Now, the financial industry has resisted regulation. And for that, if you go back to the New York Times, you find many stories, like the Stock Exchange Commission. The US, like our SEBI, has the SEC. Now, there's a story which appeared in the New York Times which shows that in April 2004, there was a very important meeting that was held in the SEC. And what was that meeting? That meeting was to see what kind of regulation should take place in the stock market. It's very interesting. There were two software experts who were called to that meeting. And then there were other financial people and various other people who were there. These two software experts warned, saying the kind of instruments, the financial instruments we're building, nobody really understands. These CDOs, the CDSs, the kind of derivatives on the foreign exchange, the derivatives on other things, these are all very risky. And therefore they said, this kind of financial instruments should not be allowed. If you allow these kind of financial instruments, then you don't know what kind of problems you'll get into. Now from next meeting onward, these people are not called for the meeting. Okay? Why? Because the financial experts said, we have to have deregulation. Okay? And therefore, what was done was something of a subterfuge. What was it? You see, there's a regulation in Europe that all entities operating in the markets have to be regulated. But there's a clause which said that if you are regulated in your own country, then you don't get regulated by the European commissions. Okay? But in the US, the regulation had ended. Whereas formally there was regulation, but there was really no regulation. So these entities like Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, etc. had no regulation. Because in Europe, the idea was that they'd be regulated in the US. And in the US, the regulation had ceased. So therefore, there's no regulation. And as a result, the deregulation moved far beyond what was prudential. And this kind of thing kept on happening. And similarly, as I'll mention, there's another very interesting story in the New York Times about Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. These two entities which go into housing mortgage, they did not enter into these financial markets. And they were pressurized from 2002 onward that they must enter these markets. And congressmen actually went and met the chiefs of the Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and say, you have to do this. And you must do this subprime lending so that the poor people can get housing. And on the other hand, Goldman Sachs and these Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns, their CEOs were going, they needed more funds to come into the financial markets. And they said, if you don't do it, we set up alternate agencies to do this housing mortgage. And you are being dodgy. That's the term they use. You are being dodgy. You're not going in, you can earn a lot more. And that's what the congressmen were saying. You can earn a lot more money and use that for subprime lending. Okay? So entities like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae with huge resources, roughly $4 trillion of resources, but very low capital of their own, they had a high gearing ratio. They were forced to enter these markets. And that is where the collapse of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae actually became very, very important. And that's why they had to be protected. Because if you allowed entities with $4 trillion of assets to collapse, that would have set off a very, very deep collapse. Okay? So in other words, deregulation was introduced into various things. Into Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, other kinds of institutions, etc. The Stock Exchange Commission was deregulating, etc. So a huge deregulation took place of the entire financial system. And that set up the base for the crisis that actually overtook everybody. Okay, let me jump a few of these slides. Now, governments are intervening, but it's not producing results. Why? Because there's a complete crisis of confidence. And I'll explain what this crisis of confidence is. Because all financial markets, all banks work on a certain degree of trust and certain degree of confidence. If I put my money into a bank, then I'm confident that when I go to the bank, I can withdraw the money. If tomorrow it is a case that I'm not allowed to withdraw the money, okay, or I fear, then there'd be a run on the bank because everybody would want to go and withdraw the first. Okay, so financial markets and money markets work on trust, work on confidence, and that should never be shattered. The moment it's shattered, it results in a crisis and it results in a bank run, etc., etc. And that is the kind of problem that we are running into. Okay. Now, this slide gives you a little bit. I'm not going to go into technical details, but this is what tells you that money that is created in the market, okay, is a multiple of the money that is released by the Reserve Bank or the central bank. Okay, in very simple, non-technical terms, that is what it is. So, for instance, in India, if the Reserve Bank has released, say, 6.5 lakh crores of rupee that they're circulating in the market, then M3, that is the total money supply, becomes 42 lakhs. So, in other words, the economy creates 7 times more money than actually what is the money released by the Reserve Bank into the market. So, that's the money multiplier. Similarly, and this depends on prudential norms, etc. There is in the financial market, on top of the money that you have, another multiple by which you create financial assets. So suppose I have 100 rupees. What I do is, with that 100 rupees, I buy shares, then I borrow on the shares.